Hi there, my name's Traci O'Dea. I'm an American poet living in Jersey, and today I'm going to give you a short introduction to poetry using one of my poems called Restricted Movement. I hope you enjoy. Restricted Movement. The COVID-19 Restricted Movement Jersey Order 2020 makes it an offense for islanders to go to or remain in public places. gov.je. No order tells my dad what he can't do. You'd think he'd be the one most used to it, but prison didn't break him, only made him value freedom more. He disappears for weeks to prove the rules do not apply to him. Each time, my heart sours, a fizz like blue-green algae film on stagnant pond. Neighbors ask if he's okay. I lie and say he's fine, or maybe it's a prayer. I try to recall what it was like before, what I worried about. Earlier still, my whole childhood he spent in jail. I slept just fine back then. I never dreamt of him. You'd think I'd be the one most used to it. I definitely recommend reading a poem twice before you start really looking into it. So I'm going to read it again. Restricted Movement. The COVID-19 Restricted Movement Jersey Order 2020 makes it an offense for islanders to go to or remain in public places. gov.je. No order tells my dad what he can't do. You'd think he'd be the one most used to it, but prison didn't break him, only made him value freedom more. He disappears for weeks to prove the rules do not apply to him. Each time, my heart sours, a fizz like blue-green algae film on stagnant pond. Neighbors ask if he's okay. I lie and say he's fine, or maybe it's a prayer. I try to recall what it was like before, what I worried about. Earlier still, my whole childhood he spent in jail. I slept just fine back then. I never dreamt of him. You'd think I'd be the one most used to it. Now that you've had a chance to read along to the poem twice, I just want your first impressions, and one of the easiest way to ascertain your first impressions is to ask about the mood of the poem. How does the poem make you feel? Choose one of these emojis to describe what you think the mood of the poem is. There isn't necessarily a right or a wrong answer. Poetry is open to interpretation, so this is your choice. How do you think the speaker feels in the poem, or how does the poem make you feel? Circle one emoji that you think best fits with the mood of the poem. Once you've chosen the mood, go through the poem and try to find words or phrases that support your decision. See if there's anything in here that agrees with the mood that you chose. If not, you might want to go back and choose a different mood, or you might have to look a little bit closer and try to decide why you chose that mood and what evidence there is in the poem to support it. A pretty simple way to start understanding a poem is to look at its title. The poet chose that title for a reason, so it obviously has a significance. This poem also has an epigraph. An epigraph is a literary device that usually occurs at the beginning of the poem, after the title and before the text. An epigraph is usually a short quotation. It could be from a poem or another literary work, or in this case, a law, and it will always be by a different writer than the writer of the text. Take a look at the title and the epigraph and how they relate to the rest of the poem. Who is restricted in this poem, and how so? Another easy way to start analyzing a poem and to start understanding it is to look at the point of view. Point of view simply means the perspective from which the poem is told. This could be first person, second person, or third person. First person means that it is told from an I or me perspective. For example, from Elizabeth Bishop's One Art. I lost 2 cities, lovely ones, and vaster, some realms I owned, 2 rivers, a continent. I missed them, but it wasn't a disaster. Second person perspective is when you are addressing a you. From Richard Hugo's Degrees of Grey in Phillipsburg. You might come here Sunday on a whim, say your life broke down, the last good kiss you had was years ago. And then lastly, third person point of view will address a he, a she, or a they, or sometimes a neutral one, but it wouldn't have any other first person perspective in it at all. So it has to be only in third person point of view. This is from Gwendolyn Brooks' The Bean Eaters. They eat beans mostly, this old yellow pair. Dinner is a casual affair. So have a look at restricted movement and decide which perspective you think that it is. Which is the dominant perspective? There are a lot of different pronouns in here for you to consider. But what you really want to think about is the speaker's perspective. Is the speaker a detached narrator, an instructive narrator, or is the speaker a personal narrator? And then from there, you should be able to figure out which perspective this poem is in. Another straightforward way to approach a piece of poetry is to look at its form. It's pretty simple. Just look at it on the page. How many lines does it have? Are they long lines or short lines? How many stanzas does it have? If you're wondering what a stanza is, it's just a poetic paragraph, a grouping of lines that are separate from other lines. So in this case, how many stanzas are there? How long is each stanza? The epigraph doesn't count as a stanza. You only want to count the text that the poet actually wrote herself. Now we're getting into the nitty-gritty. This is the fun stuff. This is sort of what makes poetry poetry, and those are poetic devices. We're going to look at a few different types of poetic devices and define them, and then find examples in the poem. You should all know what a simile is. It's a comparison that uses like or as to compare one thing to another. For example, she tried to get rid of the kitten which had scrambled up her back and stuck like a burr just out of reach. From Louisa May Alcott's Little Women. In this case, the kitten is being compared to a burr. Now have a look at my poem Restricted Movement and see if you can find any examples of similes in this poem. The next poetic device, a metaphor, is also a comparison, but in this case, the words like or as are not used. The writer simply says that one thing is another. For example, in William Shakespeare's play As You Like It, a character says, "All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players." So in this case, Shakespeare is comparing the world to a stage, and the men and women on it are players or actors on a stage. Shakespeare isn't saying that they are like players or that the world is like a stage. Shakespeare is saying this is what it is. See if you can find any examples of metaphor in my poem, Restricted Movement. Repetition can be a repeated word, a phrase, a sound. Sometimes a whole line is repeated. Like in this poem, One Art by Elizabeth Bishop. The art of losing isn't hard to master. So many things seem filled with the intent to be lost that their loss is no disaster. Lose something every day, except the fluster of lost door keys, the hour badly spent. The art of losing isn't hard to master. Now go through restricted movement and see if you see any examples of repetition. The next poetic device we're going to look at is enjambment, or as I'd say in American, enjambment. This is when the meaning of the line is incomplete and carries on to the next line. For example, in Theodore Roethke's My Papa's Waltz, we romped until the pans slid from the kitchen shelf. The thought of the line is not complete until you go on to the next line. In this case, it's an example of when the form imitates the meaning as well, because as you read about the pans sliding from the kitchen shelf, the line also slides into the next one. I'm going to read through the poem again, and as I'm reading through, tick off any lines that end on what you think is an incomplete thought. No order tells my dad what he can't do. You'd think he'd be the one most used to it. But prison didn't break him, only made him value freedom more. He disappears for weeks to prove the rules do not apply to him. Each time my heart sours, a fizz like blue-green algae film on stagnant pond. Neighbors ask if he's okay. I lie and say he's fine, or maybe it's a prayer. I try to recall what it was like before, what I worried about. Earlier still, my whole childhood he spent in jail. I slept just fine back then. I never dreamt of him. You'd think I'd be the one most used to it. Now it's your turn to really think. Have a look at the different poetic devices that you've identified in this poem and see how they relate back to the mood that you identified, and also how do they enhance your understanding of the poem. Choose at least two of the poetic devices that we identified: metaphor, simile, repetition, and enjambment. Choose an example or two for each, and try to analyze how those examples reflect the meaning of the poem, or how they enhance the meaning of the poem, and how they have improved your understanding of the poem. You can stop here to give yourself an opportunity to write about the different poetic devices, or if you'd like a slightly more in-depth look at the form, I'm going to carry on to discuss sonnets and iambic pentameter. An almost microscopic approach to the form includes looking at a poem syllabically to analyze the meter or rhythm of the poem. So let's look and see how many syllables there are per line and whether or not we can identify a meter that's being repeated. The first thing we want to do, and it's straightforward enough, is to count how many syllables there are in each line. Not every poem has the same amount of syllables in every line. In this case, most of the lines have the same amount of syllables. Can you count them and write down next to each line how many syllables there are in each line? Now that we know how many syllables there are in each line, we want to see if we can identify a basic rhythm that pervades the poem. It doesn't have to be exact for every single line, but it should be the most common rhythm throughout the poem. I'm going to read a couple of lines of the poem, emphasizing the rhythm. No order tells my dad what he can't do. You'd think he'd be the one most used to it. But prison didn't break him, only made him value freedom more. He disappears for weeks to prove the rules do not apply to him. So you might have noticed that that was a pattern of syllables that went unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed. No order tells my dad what he can't do. Da-dum, 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 da-dum. That rhythm, or meter, da-dum, 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 has a name. It's called iambic pentameter, and it is the most common meter used in the English language. You will find it in most of Shakespeare, most of John Milton's work, and a lot of contemporary poetry is written in iambic pentameter. Basically, it has to have 10 syllables and they have to follow that rhythm. The example that I've included that's really easy to remember is from William Shakespeare's Richard III. A horse, my kingdom for a horse. Da-dum, 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 da-dum. A lot of times you'll see poems in iambic pentameter that also rhyme. But blank verse is when poetry is written in iambic pentameter that does not rhyme. Here's an example from John Milton's Paradise Lost. And rest can never dwell, hope never comes that comes to all, but torture without end still urges, and a fiery deluge fed with ever-burning sulfur unconsumed. Note that it does have the regular rhythm of iambic pentameter, but none of the lines rhyme. My poem Restricted Movement does not have a regular rhyme scheme. There are a couple of end words that rhyme. Let's see. Apply in line 5 rhymes with lie in line 8. You could make a case for some slant rhymes, prayer, before, disappears, but there is not a regular rhyme scheme that the poem sticks to. In that case, this poem would be called a blank verse poem because the meter is a regular meter, iambic pentameter, but there is not a regular rhyme scheme. So it would be a blank verse poem. I'm sure you've heard the word sonnet before. Sonnet just means a little song. But it also represents a poem of 14 lines. The poem is often about love. A lot of Shakespeare's sonnets are about love. Or it will present an argument. This argument usually flips on its head at some point. This is called a volta. This is the turn where the poem shifts in the middle of the poem. Sonnets also typically adhere to a regular rhyme scheme. Have a look at my poem Restricted Movement and determine if you think it fits the definition of a sonnet. Why or why not? I want to thank you for your attention today and for learning about poetry with me. I want to thank your teachers for giving you this presentation, and I also want to thank Art House Jersey's seed funding grant, which allowed me to have the time to make this presentation for you. I hope you enjoy reading more and more poetry.